The final closing of the heavy oak door of the Providence Gulch Meeting Hall sounded less like a latch clicking and more like the snapping of a bone. For Ilara, it was the sound of her life breaking in two. Outside, the autumn air was sharp, carrying the first premonition of the winter that would, according to the town elders, surely be her last. Inside that room, her world had been dismantled piece by legal piece. Mr. Graves, the cattle baron whose fences now bit into lands that had once been her family's, had stood with his hands behind his back, a portrait of magnanimous theft. He had won. The convoluted claim, the faded ink on an old map, the purchased testimony, it had all worked. She was left with what the council, in its cold and measured charity, deemed uncontested. A deed pressed into her palm by the town clerk, whose eyes refused to meet hers. It was for a 40-acre plot north of the valley, a place universally known as the Sinking Hollow. It was a joke, a cruel piece of bureaucratic mockery. The land was a boggy, useless depression, perpetually damp, where the ground was too soft for a foundation and the air too thick with pests in the summer. No one had ever tried to live there. It was a place you walked around. Her inventory of worldly goods was brutally short. The deed. $27, the council's final insulting settlement for a farm that had supported her family for 2 generations. She had the clothes on her back, a sturdy wool dress and worn leather boots. She had her father's felling axe, its head carefully wrapped in oilcloth, and a small canvas sack containing a whetstone, a tinderbox, and a half-empty bag of salt. That was everything. She was 20 years old, an orphan, a widow of a fever that had taken her husband a year prior, and now an exile. As she stood on the steps, the town's judgment washed over her. It was not a wave of anger, but a slow, cold tide of pity and dismissal. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, paused from sweeping his boardwalk. "A shame, Ilara," he'd said, his voice laced with the false sympathy of a man who saw only a failed transaction. "You should take that money and buy a stagecoach ticket east. There's nothing for you here now." His wife nodded beside him, clutching her shawl, her eyes saying what her mouth would not. "You are doomed." Others were less subtle. Brant, a trapper whose rugged self-assurance was the town's gold standard for masculinity, laughed outright as he overheard her destination. The Sinking Hollow? Graves might as well have given her a plot at the bottom of the creek. She'll be back begging for scraps before the first snow. The words spread like a contagion, and soon a nickname was born, whispered from the church steps to the saloon bar. The Folly Girl. The girl who would trade her life for a swamp. She saw it in their faces, the certainty of her failure. They expected her to break. They expected her to take Mr. Gable's advice, to become a ghost, a story told to frighten children about the dangers of pride. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of the axe in one hand and the worthless paper of the deed in the other, a different feeling began to smolder beneath the cold ash of her grief. It was a quiet, hard knot of refusal. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not run. Without another look at the town that had cast her out, Ilara turned her back on Providence Gulch. She walked past the mercantile, past the blacksmith shop where the clang of the hammer sounded like a ticking clock, and past the last sturdy cabin at the edge of the settlement. She did not go to the stagecoach office. Instead, she went to the farrier and spent 3 of her precious dollars on a heavy iron spade and a used pickaxe. With her remaining 24, she bought a small sack of flour, another of beans, and a box of precious lucifer matches. She strapped the new tools to her pack, squared her shoulders against the weight, and pointed her face north toward the Sinking Hollow. She walked not with hope, but with a grim, bone-deep resolve. If she was to die, she would not do it in a place of their choosing. The journey was a descent into isolation. The well-worn wagon track that led from Providence Gulch dwindled to a hunter's path, then to a mere deer trail, and finally vanished altogether. The landscape grew wilder, the pines thicker, the ground underfoot softer and more treacherous. For 2 days she walked, the weight of her pack and tools a constant biting agony in her shoulders and back. The silence was a living thing, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of some unseen creature in the underbrush. The world of Providence Gulch, with its gossip and its false pity, felt 1,000 miles away. Here there was only the wind, the trees, and the grueling reality of each step forward. On the evening of the second day she arrived. She stood on a low ridge looking down into the sinking hollow. And for the first time, the hard knot of resolve in her stomach dissolved into a cold, liquid dread. The town was right. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not a hollow so much as a basin, a 40-acre mistake, carved into the earth, ringed by stony hills. The floor of the basin was a mottled carpet of dark green and brown, a treacherous expanse of sphagnum moss, cattails, and dark brackish pools of standing water. The air was heavy, still, and damp, smelling of decay and wet earth. A low mist clung to the ground, even in the late afternoon sun, giving the place a spectral, haunted quality. It looked like a wound in the land that would never heal. Her knees felt weak. She slid down the side of her pack and sat on a cold stone, the pickaxe digging into her back. This was it. This was her inheritance, a soggy grave. The whispers of the townspeople echoed in her mind. The folly girl. She'll be back before the first snow. For a long, terrifying moment, she believed them. Despair was a physical force, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the bog, making it look like a landscape of grasping claws. Tears, hot and sharp, stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. She spent that night huddled under a rocky overhang on the ridge, a small fire her only companion. She slept in fits, the damp chill seeping into her bones, the strange, gurgling sounds of the bog filling the darkness. When dawn broke, gray and cheerless, she forced herself to her feet. The despair of the previous evening had cooled into a numb, grim determination. She would explore it. She would walk its perimeter. She would know the shape of her prison before she surrendered to it. She started on the western edge, where the stony hills were steepest. The ground was firmer here, littered with granite boulders and the skeletal remains of fallen pines. She made her way carefully, testing each footstep. As she moved deeper into the basin, the ground grew softer, spongier. She could feel the waterlogged earth giving way beneath her boots. It was then, as she paused to catch her breath near a cluster of stunted willows, that she noticed it. It was not something she saw, but something she felt. The air was different here, in the lowest part of the hollow. The sharp, biting chill that had been her constant companion was gone. It was replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible mildness. She held up her hand, the skin raw and chapped from the cold. The air against her palm was not warm, but it lacked the knife's edge of the wind on the ridge. It was still, dead still. Frowning, she knelt down. She pressed her bare palm against the mossy ground. It was cool and wet, as she expected. But as she held it there, another sensation registered. Beneath the surface dampness, there was something else. A deep, resonant, and undeniable lack of cold. It was as if the earth itself was breathing out a faint, constant sigh of warmth. She dug her fingers into the moss, through the layer of peat, and touched the dark, rich soil beneath. It was cool, but not frozen. It was the feeling of a deep cellar, not an open field in late autumn. A flicker of something, not yet hope, but a fierce, desperate curiosity, ignited within her. She stood up and began to walk again, this time with purpose. She moved from spot to spot, pressing her hand to the ground. Everywhere in the basin's lowest reaches, it was the same. The surface was cold and wet, but the deep earth held a steady, stable temperature, a geothermal secret hidden beneath a blanket of worthless bog. The sinking hollow was not a grave, it was an embrace. The earth was not trying to swallow her, it was trying to keep her warm. The town was wrong. The deed was not a joke, it was a key. The work began that same day. Ilara's despair was burned away by the fire of a singular, all-consuming purpose. She would not just survive in the hollow, she would merge with it. She would build her home not on the land, but in it, harnessing the deep, patient warmth she had discovered. Her first task was to choose the location. She selected a spot on the gentlest slope of the western side, where a natural depression was already carved into the hillside, sheltered from the northern winds by a thick shoulder of granite. It was the perfect place to dig. The labor was a relentless, brutal assault on her body. The iron spade felt like an extension of her own screaming muscles. She dug into the hillside, her movements rhythmic and mechanical. First, she peeled back the thick layer of moss and peat, stacking it carefully to one side. Then, she hit the soil, a dense, heavy clay mixed with stone. Each shovelful was a dead weight that had to be lifted and thrown down the slope. By the end of the first day, her hands were a mess of raw, broken blisters. Her back was a column of fire. Exhaustion was a physical presence, a heavy cloak she could not shrug off. She collapsed into her lean-to on the ridge, ate a handful of cold beans, and fell into a sleep so deep it was like a small death. The next day and the day after, and for 2 weeks, she dug. The hole grew deeper, wider. It was a pit, 10 feet wide and 15 feet long, dug straight into the earth, its back wall the solid granite of the hillside. The deeper she went, the more pronounced the geothermal effect became. At 5 feet down, the clay walls were cool to the touch, but never cold. They held the steady temperature of a root cellar. This pit would be her home. Now she needed walls and a roof. For this, she turned to the woods on the ridges above the hollow. Her father's axe, which had felt like a burden on the journey, now felt like a part of her arm. She was not a natural woodsman, but her father had taught her the basics. She chose straight, dead-standing pines, felling them with clumsy, powerful swings. Limbing them was exhausting work, but seeing the clean, straight logs pile up was a deep, primal satisfaction. Getting the logs from the ridge down to her pit was a battle of leverage and sheer will. She used smaller logs as rollers, her own weight as a brake, guiding the heavy timbers down the slope with a system of ropes and brute force. More than once a log got away from her, crashing into the trees below. Each failure was a stab of frustration, but each success, each log settled into place beside her pit, was a monumental victory. She laid the first logs for the front and side walls, notching them at the corners as her father had shown her. She built the walls up from the lip of the pit so that half her home would be subterranean, insulated by the earth, and the other half would be a traditional log structure. The gaps between the logs were enormous. For this, she turned to the hollow itself. She mixed the heavy clay she had excavated with dried moss and water, creating a thick, sticky mortar. She packed this chinking into every crack and crevice, her hands caked in mud, her fingers numb. It was slow, tedious work, but as the walls became solid, she could feel the space changing. It was no longer a pit, it was a room. The roof was the greatest challenge. She laid smaller logs across the top of the walls, then covered them with a thick layer of pine boughs. On top of this, she packed the slabs of peat she had saved, creating a living roof, a thick, insulating blanket of earth. Finally, she took her spade and covered the entire peat layer with the heavy clay, packing it down until it was a single, solid shell. She left 2 openings, one for a door and a smaller one in the roof for a smoke hole. Section. Her shelter was a hybrid, part cave, part cabin, a beast of earth and wood. It was ugly, squat, and half buried in the ground. But when she stepped inside for the first time, out of the biting wind, the difference was breathtaking. The air inside was still and calm. The earthen walls radiated a quiet, neutral coolness, a stark contrast to the freezing granite outside. It was not warm, not yet, but it was sheltered. It was a start. Now she needed systems. First, heat. The back wall of her shelter was the granite of the hillside. Using her pickaxe and sheer determination, she chipped away at the rock, creating a shallow alcove. Here she built a fireplace, not of mortared stone, but of carefully stacked flat rocks, using the granite cliff face as the fireback. The stone would absorb the heat from the fire and radiate it back into the room long after the flames died down, a massive thermal battery. For a chimney, she used a natural fissure in the granite that she had discovered, a thin crack that ran all the way to the top of the ridge. She painstakingly widened the opening inside her shelter until it was large enough to draw smoke. When she lit the first fire, a small, tentative flame of dry twigs, she held her breath. The smoke hesitated, curled in the room, and then, as if drawn by a gentle hand, it streamed upwards and vanished into the rock. It worked. The quiet pride of that moment was more warming than the fire itself. Next, water. The bog water was stagnant and unsafe. But on the hillside just above her shelter, she had noticed a constant, slow seep of water from beneath a shelf of rock. It was clean, clear groundwater, filtered by the earth. She spent a week digging a narrow trench, lining it with clay to make it waterproof, channeling the water from the seep down the hill. The trench ended in a deep pit she had dug next to her home. She lined this cistern with a thick layer of the same clay, pounding it until it was as hard and smooth as pottery. The water trickled in, slowly filling the basin. Within days, she had 100 gallons of fresh, clean water just steps from her door. Food was the final piece. She could not farm the bog, but she could garden in her cellar. She designated a corner of her subterranean home for a garden bed. She hauled buckets of the dark, rich topsoil from the woods down into her shelter, mixing it with peat and sand. It was a back-breaking task, but the result was a 3-foot-deep bed of perfect soil, insulated from the frost. Here, she would grow potatoes, carrots, and turnips through the winter, their green tops reaching for the faint light from the doorway. For preservation, she dug a smaller, deeper hole in the floor, a cold cellar that held a constant, near-freezing temperature, perfect for storing root vegetables and any game she might be lucky enough to catch. With the core of her world established, she knew she needed more. She needed protein, and she needed a companion. It was time to return to Providence Gulch. She put on her cleanest clothes, tied her hair back, and walked out of her hollow, leaving the strange, silent world she had built behind. Walking back into town was like stepping into a different reality. The noise, the smells, the people. It was a sensory shock after the deep solitude of the hollow. Her appearance caused an immediate stir. She was thinner, her face browned by the wind, her hands calloused and scarred. Her clothes were stained with clay and pine resin. She was no longer the pitiable widow. She was something wilder, something they did not understand. Whispers followed her as she walked to the mercantile. "It's the Folly Girl. Look at her hands. Still alive then." The words were pebbles thrown at her back. She ignored them. Inside the store, Mr. Gable stopped polishing the counter and stared. His expression was a mixture of surprise and condescension. "Elara, I'd heard you were still out there. Figured you'd have come to your senses by now." "I need supplies," she said, her voice quiet but firm, unused to speaking to anyone but herself. She laid out her list: 2 laying hens, a young goat, a nanny, a sack of oats, more salt, a length of wire. Gable laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Livestock? For the bog? What are you going to do, teach them to swim? The wolves will have them in a week." "The price, Mr. Gable," she said, meeting his gaze. He shook his head, still smirking, and named a price that was surely inflated. It took almost all of her remaining money. As he gathered the items, he offered more of his unsolicited wisdom. "You can't fight the land, girl, especially not that land. It's a losing battle. You build on high, dry ground. You build with seasoned timber. That's the way." She said nothing, simply paid her bill, and waited. Leading a goat on a rope and carrying 2 squawking chickens in a crate through the center of town was a public spectacle. Brant, the trapper, was standing outside the saloon. He tipped his hat in mock reverence. "Well, I'll be the queen of the swamp, collecting her subjects." His friends roared with laughter. Ilara kept her eyes forward, her face a mask of stone, and walked out of town without looking back. The journey home was even harder than the first. The goat was stubborn, and the chickens complained incessantly. But as she descended back into her hollow, a sense of peace settled over her. This was her place. The bleating of the goat and the clucking of the hens were the first sounds of life other than her own to grace the sinking hollow. She had built a small pen for them against the warmest wall of her shelter, where the geothermal heat would keep them from freezing. A few days later, she found her final and most important addition. While checking a snare line she had set for rabbits, she found him, a dog, skeletal and shivering, one paw caught in the wire. It was a mix of something big and shaggy, its fur matted with burrs and mud. It didn't growl or snap as she approached, only watched her with eyes full of a deep, weary pain. She carefully released its paw, which was swollen but not broken. It made no move to run. It simply lay there, exhausted and defeated. She looked at the dog, and in its ragged form she saw a reflection of herself, abandoned, starved, and left to die. She knelt and offered it a piece of dried meat from her pack. The dog ate it slowly, cautiously. That night it followed her back to her shelter. It didn't try to come inside, but lay by the entrance, a silent, watchful guardian. She named him Moss. He was the final piece of her new world. The bond between them was forged in the shared silence and the common struggle for survival. The town's mockery solidified into a proper legend. Travelers who passed near the sinking hollow would sometimes see a thin plume of smoke rising from the fissure on the ridge, a ghostly exhalation from the earth. They would see a lone figure moving through the mist, followed by a large, shaggy dog. The stories they brought back to Providence Gulch were embellished with each telling. She was a witch, living in a hole. She was mad, talking to the bog. The nickname, the Folly Girl, was now often replaced with Bog Witch Ilara. It was a story told around firesides, a cautionary tale about a woman who had defied common sense and embraced the wilderness. One afternoon, Brant, the trapper, decided to see the foolishness for himself. He followed her tracks from the woods down into the hollow. He found her clearing her water channel, her dog Moss watching him from a distance with a low growl. Brant leaned on his rifle, a smirk playing on his lips. "Still at it, I see," he called out. "Digging in the mud like a badger?" Ilara straightened up, wiping her hands on her trousers. She simply looked at him, her silence more unnerving than any reply. "Winter's coming, girl," he said, his tone shifting to one of feigned concern. "A real one, by the looks of the beaver lodges. This hole in the ground won't save you. When the freeze hits, this whole place will turn to iron. You and your goat will be statues." He gestured at her half-buried home. "This is a grave you're digging. There's still time to come back to town. Folks will help." It was an offer wrapped in an insult. "This land is mine," she said, her voice flat and even. "I'm not leaving." Brant shook his head, chuckled, and turned to leave. "Have it your way. Don't come crying to us when the cold starts to bite." His laughter echoed across the hollow as he climbed back up the ridge. As autumn bled into winter, life in the hollow settled into a deep, quiet routine. The world shrank to the size of her shelter and the systems that sustained it. Each day was a testament to the world she had built. She would wake in the near darkness, the air in her home cool but not frigid. The first task was always the fire, adding logs to the glowing embers in the stone hearth. The sound of the fire crackling to life was the heartbeat of her home. Then she would tend to the animals. The goat and the chickens lived in their lean-to, their bodies and the geothermal warmth from the shelter's wall creating a small pocket of survivable warmth. She would milk the goat, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, the warm milk hissing into the pail. The chickens, miraculously, were still laying. Each egg was a treasure, a perfect orb of protein she held in her palm like a jewel. Her days were a cycle of maintenance. She checked the water cistern, breaking the thin crust of ice that formed on the surface overnight. She tended her subterranean garden, the pale green shoots of the potato plants, a defiant miracle in the dim light. She checked her snares, repaired the chinking in her walls, and stockpiled firewood, stacking it along the interior walls where it would stay dry. Moss was her constant shadow, a warm, breathing presence in the profound solitude. His companionship was a bulwark against the loneliness that sometimes threatened to creep in during the long, silent evenings. A smaller test came in late November. An early, vicious cold snap descended from the north. For 3 days, the temperature plummeted. The wind howled over the ridge, a physical force that scoured the landscape. In Providence Gulch, the sudden freeze caught people unprepared. Water barrels split. The creek froze solid almost overnight. The cold was a thief, slipping through the cracks in their well-built cabins. In the hollow, Elara watched the storm from her doorway. The surface of the bog froze into a sheet of black, pockmarked ice. The trees on the ridge were coated in a thick armor of frost, but inside her shelter the world held. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, its heat sinking into the granite fireback. The earthen walls and roof held the geothermal warmth, a silent, unyielding defense against the raging cold. The temperature inside her home dropped, but only by a few degrees. It remained above freezing. Her animals were safe. Her water, in its insulated cistern, was still liquid. The system worked. As the cold snap broke and a fragile sun returned, she felt a deep, unshakable confidence settle in her bones. She was not fighting the winter. She was simply outside its reach. The real winter arrived in the 3rd week of December. It did not come gradually. It descended like a hammer. The old-timers in Providence Gulch would later call it the Great Hard Freeze of '83. It was a weather event beyond memory or precedent, a tide of Arctic air that rolled down from the mountains and did not recede. The sky turned a strange, hazy white, and the sun became a pale, useless coin in the sky. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero, then 20, then 30. And it stayed there. The wind was not just a sound, it was a weapon. It screamed like a banshee around the corners of the cabins in town, clawing at the roofs, driving powdered snow into every microscopic crack. The world outside became an alien landscape of white and gray, hostile to all life. The very air felt sharp enough to cut, burning the lungs with every breath. In the sinking hollow, Elara felt the change. The cold was a palpable pressure against her small fortress, but her shelter held. Inside, the air was cool, but the deep chill of the outside world could not penetrate the thick layers of earth and peat. The massive stone of her fireback, now saturated with weeks of accumulated heat, radiated a steady, gentle warmth that kept the core of the room comfortable. The animals huddled in their pen, calm and protected. The water in her cistern was insulated by the earth around it. The rhythmic drip of the seep that fed it slowed, but it did not stop. She was an island of stability in a world of shattering cold. In Providence Gulch, the community's confidence, built on generations of conventional wisdom, shattered in a matter of days. Their sturdy log cabins, built on high, dry ground, proved terribly vulnerable. The seasoned timber, which Mr. Gable had praised, contracted in the extreme cold, opening up gaps in the chinking. The cold poured in like water. Roofs, not designed for such conditions, began to fail under the weight of immense ice dams that formed and reformed overnight. The sound of a roof beam cracking under the strain became a terrifyingly common sound in the night. Panic began to set in. Firewood, stockpiled for a normal winter, was being burned at an alarming rate. Families huddled together in a single room, feeding their fires constantly. Yet still the cold crept in. Livestock, kept in traditional wooden barns, began to freeze to death where they stood. The town's water source, the creek, was frozen solid to a depth of 4 feet. People were reduced to melting snow, a laborious process that consumed precious fuel. The meeting hall, the symbol of their community, suffered a catastrophic failure when a main support beam, frozen brittle, snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The town that had prided itself on its toughness and practicality was breaking. Their methods had failed. They were isolated, freezing, and afraid. On the 5th day of the hard freeze, as the wind outside shrieked like something being tortured, Ilara was checking the seal on her door when Moss suddenly shot to his feet, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. He stood facing the door, the fur on his back rigid. Ilara froze, listening. Over the roar of the wind, she heard it. A faint, desperate banging. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one should be out in this. No one could survive it. She grabbed a heavy wooden bar she used to brace the door and, with Moss at her side, pulled it open a crack. The wind tore at the opening, blasting her with air so cold it felt like fire. A figure was slumped against the frame, a shapeless bundle of frost-covered furs. It fell forward into the room as the door opened, collapsing onto the earthen floor. It was Brant, the trapper. His face was a mask of ice and frozen blood, his beard a solid chunk of frost. His eyes were wild with pain and exhaustion. But he was not alone. He was clutching a small, bundled form to his chest. With a groan, he pushed the bundle toward her. "The boy," he rasped, his voice a dry, broken whisper. "Gable's boy. He's sick. The fever." Ilara stared, her mind struggling to process the scene. Brant, the man who had laughed at her, was dying on her floor, and he had brought her the son of Mr. Gable, the man who had led the chorus of her dismissal. She looked at the small bundle. It was a child, no more than 6 years old, wrapped in blankets that were stiff with frost. His face was pale, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. For a single, cold moment, the memory of their mockery, of their smug certainty, flashed through her mind. Let them freeze. Let them see what a grave feels like. The thought was bitter and ugly. Then she looked at the child. His small, chapped lips were blue. He was innocent of his father's pride. She looked at Brant, a man broken by the very wilderness he claimed to have mastered. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. She could not let them die. Not here. Not on her threshold. Her own carefully rationed world was about to be tested. Helping them would cost her fuel, food, and the quiet safety she had so painstakingly built. But not helping them would cost her something far more valuable, the person she had become in this desolate place. "Bring him to the fire," she said, her voice clear and commanding. She slammed the door shut against the howling storm and barred it. The sudden silence was profound. Brant, moving with the slowness of a man near his end, crawled toward the hearth, dragging the boy with him. Ilara moved with a purpose that bordered on ferocity. She grabbed her warmest furs, the ones she saved for the deepest cold, and began to strip the frozen layers off the boy. His skin was icy to the touch. She wrapped him in the dry, warm pelts and placed him as close to the radiating stone of the hearth as was safe. Then she turned to Brant. "Your hands and feet," she ordered. He looked down, as if just noticing. His gloves were frozen solid, and his boots were like blocks of wood. The rescue was a grim, painful process. She had to cut the gloves and boots from his body, the leather frozen to his skin. His fingers and toes were waxy and white. the telltale signs of severe frostbite. She knew that warming them too quickly could cause more damage. She filled a bucket with cool water from her cistern, water that was itself a miracle in this frozen world, and made him submerge his extremities. The pain, as the feeling began to return, was agonizing. Brant, the tough trapper, bit back screams, his body trembling violently. All the while she worked on the boy. She brewed a tea from willow bark for his fever and managed to get a few spoonfuls of the warm liquid past his lips. She heated stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them around his small body. The quiet, steady warmth of the shelter began to do its work, a gentle, persistent force against the deadly cold that had invaded their bodies. She moved between the two of them, a silent, efficient nurse, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. She was risking everything, her precious firewood burning faster, her small stores of food and medicine being depleted for the sake of the men who had named her a fool. The shock hit Brant first. As the hours passed and the immediate agony in his hands and feet subsided into a dull, throbbing ache, he began to truly see where he was. His eyes, no longer glazed with pain, widened in stunned disbelief. He was in a hole in the ground, yes, but it was a place of impossible warmth and order. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, the sacks of flour and beans, the ropes of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. He saw the green tops of the plants in the garden bed, a splash of vibrant life that seemed utterly impossible in this world of white death. He heard the soft bleating of the goat and the rustle of chickens from the pen. He looked at Alara, who was spooning warm broth into the boy's mouth. He looked at the earthen walls, the ingenious stone hearth, the clever water channel. He thought of his own cabin, its walls breached by the cold, his firewood gone, his world collapsed. He had mocked this, he had laughed at it, and it had just saved his life. He tried to speak, but no words came. He simply stared, his arrogance and pride dissolving in the face of this staggering, undeniable reality. Late the next day, another frantic banging rattled the door. It was Mr. Gable, his face a mask of terror. He had followed Brant's tracks, a desperate, suicidal journey. When Alara let him in, he stumbled past her, his eyes searching wildly. "My boy, is he—" He stopped dead when he saw his son alive, sleeping peacefully by the fire, his fever broken. Then, like Brant, he saw the rest of it. The warmth hit his frozen face like a physical blow. His gaze swept the room, the animals, the garden, the stores of food. His mind could not reconcile the scene with the stories, with the derisive nickname, with his own smug pronouncements. He turned to look at Alara, who stood watching him, her face calm, her dog at her side. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also a strength that humbled him to his core. He thought of his own store, its windows thick with frost, its shelves of goods useless against the elemental power of the cold. He thought of his fine house, now a freezing tomb. He had possessed everything a man was supposed to need to survive. She had started with nothing, and she had built this. Shame, stark and profound, washed over him. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The words felt impossibly small, yet they were all he had. "We were wrong," he said, his voice cracking. He looked from his living son to this woman, this folly girl. "My God," he whispered, to himself as much as to her. "We called you a fool. We were the fools." Alara's response was the purest form of grace. She did not say a word of triumph. She did not remind him of his mockery or his condescending advice. She simply nodded toward the pot simmering over the fire. "There is food," she said. "Eat. You must be hungry." In that simple, practical act of kindness, her victory was absolute. It was a victory not of strength over weakness, but of character over pride. When the great hard freeze finally broke a week later, the survivors of Providence Gulch emerged into a changed world. The town was scarred, beaten. They had lost homes, livestock, and a dangerous amount of their pride. The story of Alara's sanctuary, carried back by a humbled Mr. Gable and a forever altered Brant, spread through the devastated community not as a rumor, but as a gospel. The immediate aftermath was a quiet revolution. The first to visit was Gable's wife, who came not with pity, but with a basket containing her last jars of preserved peaches and a bolt of fine wool cloth. She said nothing, only pressed Ilara's calloused hands and wept. Soon others followed. They came not to mock, but to learn. They saw her subterranean home, her thermal mass fireplace, her living roof, and her protected water system. They saw that she had not fought the winter. She had sidestepped it by working with the earth, not against it. The nickname Bog Witch Ilara was never uttered again. In its place, people simply called her by her name, spoken with a new, deep-seated respect. Mr. Gable, once the town's foremost dispenser of conventional wisdom, became her quietest and most fervent advocate. He began stocking his mercantile with tools better suited for digging and masonry than for logging. Brant, his hands scarred but functional, helped her build a larger, stone-walled animal shelter using her methods of earth sheltering and passive heat. He never boasted of his trapping skills again. The impact spread beyond Providence Gulch. As the settlement rebuilt, it did so with new principles. New homes were designed with deeper foundations, with stone elements to hold heat, with a newfound respect for the insulating power of the earth. Travelers passing through carried the story of the woman in the sinking hollow to other towns, and the tale became a new kind of frontier legend, not one of conquest and domination, but one of resilience, ingenuity, and harmony. The worthless lands, the bogs and rocky hillsides were suddenly seen in a new light, not as obstacles, but as opportunities. Ilara never left her hollow. It was her home, her sanctuary, the place where she had forged herself anew. She traded her surplus vegetables, goat milk, and eggs for the few things she couldn't produce herself. She taught those who were humble enough to ask. Her world remained small, but her influence was vast. The landscape of the valley itself began to change, reflecting her quiet wisdom. Years later, as an old woman, she would often sit at her doorway in the evenings with the descendant of moss at her feet and look out over the hollow. It was no longer a place of dread, but one of lush, managed life. The water was clean, the soil was rich, and the air was filled with the sounds of her small farm. She had been cast out with nothing but a worthless deed and the scorn of her neighbors. She had taken their mockery and their judgment and buried it in the warm earth, and from it she had cultivated not just a shelter, but a life. Her legacy was not written in laws or ledgers, but was carved into the land itself, a testament to the enduring truth that what others discard can, with courage and grace, become the very foundation of survival.